3,000 people filled the Houston auditorium that night, but it felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The lights dimmed, gospel music faded, and the host's voice echoed through the hall. Ladies and gentlemen, Chuck Norris. No pyrotechnics, no intro reel. Just a man in a plain gray shirt walking toward the microphone with that calm, measured gait the whole world knew. His presence alone made the crowd hush. Even the children in the back stopped whispering. He didn't open with a joke or a story about fame or the movie roles people expected him to mention. Instead, he looked across the rows of people, smiled faintly, and said, "Discipline isn't about control. It's about respect for something bigger than you." The tone shifted instantly. This wasn't a celebrity speech. This was confession. He spoke of his early life, growing up broke, afraid, angry. He spoke of war and the brother he lost overseas. He spoke quietly, without theatrics, each word landing heavier because he never raised his voice. "You learn fast," he said, "that strength doesn't always look like winning. Sometimes it's just showing up when it hurts to stand." A murmur rolled through the audience, that kind of low sound that isn't applause yet, but something closer to reverence. He went on, pacing slowly across the stage. "Real faith," he said, "isn't proven when you stand in the light. It's when you stand beside someone who's fallen, and you don't move until they do." That was the moment the energy in the room shifted. People nodded. Some wept quietly. And then, from the front row, laughter. Not mockery, but something sharp enough to cut through the mood. Pastor John Gray, famous preacher, larger than life, known for his booming voice and fiery sermons, was shaking his head, smiling to himself. Cameras caught it. The audience followed his gaze. Chuck looked at him, still calm. Gray stood up slowly, microphone in hand. "Brother Chuck," he said, his voice full of that pulpit thunder, "with all due respect, you talk about faith like it's discipline, but some of us live it through chaos." The crowd gasped, then half cheered. This was unexpected. The energy surged again, alive, unpredictable. Chuck didn't move. He just tilted his head slightly, studying the younger man. Gray continued, pacing near the front. "Faith ain't quiet, man. Faith is fire. Faith is when you scream and still believe through the pain." A chorus of "Amen" broke out. Phones went up. The event was supposed to be a peaceful conference, but now it felt like a standoff between two worlds, calm and storm, silence and flame. Chuck let the noise run its course. Then, with the same quiet steadiness that made him famous, he stepped forward and said, "I've seen both, the scream and the silence. Only one of them ever saved me." The words dropped into the crowd like a stone in water, and the ripples spread in silence. Gray blinked, thrown off balance. The applause died on people's lips. Even the stage lights seemed dimmer now, like the air itself had thickened. Then Chuck took one small step closer to the edge of the stage. His tone softened even more. "When my brother didn't come home from war, I didn't shout at heaven. I just listened. And sometimes that's all faith is." The pastor's hand tightened around the mic. His expression changed, from confidence to something more human. The crowd waited. For a full 5 seconds, no one said a word. And then, for the first time that night, Pastor Gray spoke softly. "You talk like pain makes you holy." Chuck nodded once. "No," he said. "It just makes you honest." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. You could feel the audience realizing they weren't watching two men argue. They were watching faith being stripped of its polish, left raw and trembling in the middle of a stage. Somewhere in the back row, a man whispered, "This isn't a sermon anymore." He was right, because the next thing Chuck said, the next quiet sentence, would change the entire night. "Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel." The silence after Chuck's words lingered like a held breath. Thousands of people waited, unsure whether to clap or pray. John Gray finally spoke. "You make it sound easy," he said, voice tight. "Like pain just sits down when you tell it to." Chuck didn't rush his reply. "No," he said quietly. "Pain never sits. You just stop leaning on it." A flicker crossed John's face. Hurt, pride, something in between. He stepped closer to the stage, voice rising. "Where I'm from, faith roars. It cries out, breaks chains, shakes the ground. Faith is fire." The crowd erupted, shouts of "Amen" and "Preach" echoing through the hall. For a few seconds, it was church. Heat, rhythm, sound. Chuck waited. His stillness was almost unnerving. When the noise died, he said, "Faith can roar. But sometimes the loudest prayer is the one without words." It landed heavy. The applause didn't come. People just stared. "You ever lose something you couldn't pray away?" John asked, pacing near the front, sweat shining on his forehead. "My brother," Chuck said. That single word cracked the air. Even the cameraman froze. "I lost him in war," he continued. "For a long time I thought faith meant fighting the pain. But faith doesn't always win the fight. Sometimes it's just what lets you stand when you've already lost." A few people clapped softly, unsure if they should. "So faith is surrender?" John asked. "No," Chuck said. "It's trust. Letting go when you could keep holding on. That's not weakness. That's faith." "That's easy to say when you've got victories to back it up," John shot back. Chuck's gaze didn't move. "Victories? I buried my best friend thinking I was strong enough to save him. I wasn't. Faith didn't make me a hero. It made me human again." The crowd grew silent again. This time it wasn't tension, it was grief shared. "What do you do when faith fails you?" John asked quietly. "You wait," Chuck said. "You let it breathe. When it comes back, you handle it gentler than before." No one moved. The sound system hummed softly. John's voice cracked. "You talk about peace like it's a choice." "It is," Chuck answered. "It just costs more than anger ever will." The younger man's shoulders dropped. He no longer looked like a preacher. He looked like someone who had finally heard something he'd preached for years but never lived. Chuck turned to the crowd. "Faith doesn't need to be proven. It just needs to be lived, even when it's quiet." People stood slowly, clapping in rhythm. Not loud, but steady. A woman wiped her eyes. Two veterans in the back bowed their heads. John faced the audience. "You ever wish God spoke louder?" "He does," Chuck said, smiling faintly. "We just hear him best when we stop talking." The applause swelled again, softer this time, like gratitude instead of celebration. John looked back at him. "So your silence, that's not strategy?" "If it were," Chuck said, "it wouldn't work. Silence is just where I stop making God sound like me." The crowd murmured, touched. Phones lowered. For once, no one wanted to record it. They just wanted to stay inside that quiet. John took a breath and said almost in a whisper, "Then tell them how you carried it. Say the part you didn't say." Chuck nodded, walked to the stool, set down the microphone, and spoke without it. His voice carried anyway. "When grief wouldn't leave, I stopped asking it to. I sat with it, learned its name, told it I'd walk beside it for as long as it needed. It stopped dragging me when I stopped running from it." No applause now. Only the sound of people breathing and someone sobbing near the stage. John took a small step forward. His fire had turned into something gentler. "You talk like pain made you kind." "It made me listen," Chuck said. The pastor's hand trembled. He nodded once, almost involuntarily. "What do you do?" he asked, voice breaking. "When the silence scares you." "You don't go alone," Chuck said. For a long moment, they stood facing each other. Two men from different worlds, both suddenly very small under the lights. And somewhere in that stillness, everyone in the room understood. The debate was over. The sermon was over. Only truth remained, and it didn't need to shout. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The crowd, the lights, the cameras, all frozen in the same breath. Even the air felt heavy, like the room itself was afraid to exhale. John Gray stood with the microphone lowered to his chest. His eyes glistened under the stage light, the bravado gone. The fire that had filled his words only minutes ago flickered out, leaving something raw and human behind. "You lost your brother," he said softly, more statement than question. Chuck nodded. "Yes, and myself for a while." John took a step closer. "And how did you find yourself again?" Chuck's gaze drifted toward the empty seats in the back of the hall, as if seeing something that wasn't there. "By forgiving the part of me that couldn't save him." The words struck harder than any sermon. A sound escaped from the audience. Not applause, not gasp, but that involuntary sigh people make when truth finally lands where it's supposed to. John looked down, gripping the microphone tighter. His throat moved like he was swallowing stones. "I preach about forgiveness every week," he said quietly, "but I never said it like that. I don't think I ever felt it like that." He placed the mic on the stool beside Chuck's and just stood there. No spotlight, no performance. Two men on a stage that suddenly didn't feel like a stage anymore. "You don't need to preach it," Chuck said gently. You just have to live it once. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't move. It felt as if everyone had silently agreed to stay still, afraid that clapping would break whatever invisible thread held the room together. John ran a hand over his face. You know, he whispered, I came here tonight ready to prove a point. Chuck smiled faintly. You did. John looked up, confused. What point? That faith isn't about winning, Chuck said. It's about staying open when it would be easier to close. John let out a shaky laugh, half relief, half exhaustion. Man, I've been preaching about open hearts my whole life. Didn't realize mine had a lock on it. Chuck reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. The gesture was so small, so simple, that people in the audience leaned forward instinctively, not wanting to miss it. Locks aren't bad, Chuck said. They just mean you've got something worth protecting. You just have to remember where the key is. A tear rolled down John's cheek. He didn't hide it, didn't wipe it. The crowd saw it, and that made something in the room shift, like permission had just been granted for everyone to feel what they'd been holding back. In the front row, a man in uniform bowed his head. 2 rows back, a woman clasped her hands and whispered a prayer. The sound of quiet crying began to spread, soft as rainfall. Chuck took a slow breath. You preach fire, he said. And that's good. The world needs it. But don't forget, even fire has to rest in ashes before it rises again. John looked up at him, eyes red but steady. And what about you? You preach silence. Doesn't it ever feel lonely? It used to, Chuck said, until I realized silence isn't the absence of God. It's where he waits for you to stop performing. The crowd stirred again, some clapping through tears, others simply staring. John reached for the microphone again, not to argue, but to confess. His voice trembled as he spoke. I've been talking so loud for so long. I think I forgot who I was talking to. Chuck nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. Then stop talking, he said. Start listening. The line hit John harder than anything that night. He closed his eyes, lowered the mic, and for a moment it looked like he was praying. But the truth was simpler. He was just breathing. For the first time in years, maybe. Then he did something no one expected. He turned toward Chuck, and instead of shaking his hand, he wrapped his arms around him. A long, wordless embrace, awkward at first, then real. The crowd stood to their feet. Some clapped, some cried, but most just watched. It wasn't a performance. It was reconciliation, not between 2 men, but between fire and calm, pride and peace. When they finally pulled apart, John said into the mic, voice thick but steady. That's the kind of faith I've been preaching about. But tonight, I actually met it. The audience erupted in applause, not wild, but grateful. The kind that comes from people who've just witnessed something they'll never forget. Chuck stepped back, gave a small nod, and said, then maybe it's time to stop preaching it and start living it. John's lips trembled. He covered his face with both hands. The lights above caught the glint of tears between his fingers. For a moment, all you could hear was the quiet sound of him trying to breathe through the emotion. The cameras zoomed in, but no one in the control room dared cut away. And somewhere in that silence, something holy happened, not in a religious way, but in a deeply human one. 2 men, stripped of everything except truth, standing in front of 3,000 witnesses, reminding everyone that faith wasn't about sound or spectacle. It was about the courage to stand in the quiet and let it break you, so it could build you back again. The ovation didn't end so much as thin out, like rain moving off the highway. People stayed standing because sitting felt wrong. Some clapped, some just held their hands to their mouths, as if they'd say the wrong thing if they opened them. The band waited for a cue that never came. On stage, Chuck gave a small bow, nothing theatrical, just gratitude with its hat off, then stepped down the stairs into the shadowed wing. John remained where he was, centered in the light, not swaying yet somehow unsteady, as if balance had shifted from his feet to somewhere deep behind his ribs. Crew spilled in patterns they'd practiced for years. Camera to left, jib to parking dock, stagehands with headsets coiling cable like sailors. The floor manager approached, hand over earpiece, eyes wide with that dazed look people get when the thing they planned turned into something else and still went right. We got it, he whispered to no one and everyone. 2 operators trailed Chuck down the corridor with their shoulder rigs still lit. He lifted a palm, gentler than a stop sign. Fellas, he said, voice back to its ordinary size. Do me a favor. They halted on instinct. Don't put that last part out, he added. Not the line about my brother. Some things aren't for television. They glanced at each other, not sure if they'd heard the request or a rule. One nodded first. Understood. The other lowered his camera all the way, arms shaking from the relief more than the weight. A producer rounded the corner, breathless. We need quotes. Chuck, the networks. He shook his head once. Let people keep what they heard, he said. Don't make it smaller by explaining it. Back near the stage, applause finally collapsed into a scatter of conversations and the soft percussion of programs being folded. The MC tried to land a benediction and found his voice a half-step lower than usual. He dismissed the crowd. People didn't rush the exits. They drifted, touching shoulders, crying without embarrassment, letting ushers guide them like you steer a friend through the last block to their door. John descended from the light, as if from altitude. His hands still shook, so he put the microphone down on the edge of the stage, exactly at the seam of Gaffer's tape, and left it there. It looked like a tool he wasn't strong enough to lift or, worse, didn't want it anymore. He walked to the first row and sat. The house lights had warmed, but the seat fabric held the chill of air conditioning and spilled faith. He set both palms on his knees to feel something solid. He stared at the empty aisle and heard the ocean sound of people leaving. Shoes on concrete, paper bags, a child asking if God was in the speakers. Every so often someone recognized him, slowed, put a hand over their heart, and kept moving without words. The absence of words soothed and punished at the same time. He took out his phone, flipped the camera, and saw a face he knew from billboards but not from mirrors, swollen eyes, skin still damp at the temples. A man after the fight he didn't know he was in. He hit record and spoke to the handful of people he trusted most, then forgot who he'd intended and spoke to everyone. Tonight, he said, and his voice had to climb up to the first rung, I didn't preach. He tried to smile and failed honestly. Tonight I got preached to. The sentence landed harder than he meant, and I wasn't ready. Breath snagged. He looked away from himself to the empty stage, where two lukewarm water bottles glowed in a tired pool of light. Maybe that's the point, he said, quieter. Maybe the sermons that change you are the ones you didn't plan to hear. He stopped recording because anything more would be performance. He watched the video once, thumb hovering over delete, then set the phone face down on the seat beside him. In the wing, an organizer intercepted Chuck with the giddy reverence of someone who'd just seen a building fall the right direction. You just made a preacher cry, man. It was meant as a compliment and a headline. Chuck chuckled without humor. No, he said, tugging the cuff of his sleeve straight. I made a man remember he's human. They stood there in the cluttered intimacy of backstage. Racks of spare cables, a cart of spare batteries, a half-eaten granola bar on a monitor shelf, the smell of hot dust on lenses. A volunteer in a yellow lanyard walked past backward because her eyes hadn't learned forward again. Mr. Norris, she blurted, then found nothing else worth making into sound and vanished gratefully into a curtain. A stage tech approached John in the first row and touched the back of the seat, asking without asking if he could be there. We're powering down, Pastor, he said, apology in the phrasing. John nodded. Take your time, he murmured, and heard himself mean it. Up in the control booth, someone replayed the last 90 seconds, sound muted, just the moving images of two men losing and finding themselves in the span of a camera move. The director leaned back so far his chair knocked the wall. Don't cut that to pieces, he told the editor softly. If it's going to live, let it live whole, or not at all. The editor's hands hovered over the keyboard like a pianist deciding whether to play the coda. On the floor, a janitor began the slow, holy work of endings, righting a fallen chair, pocketing a lost pen, fishing a crumpled program from under a seat. He paused at the stage lip, saw the microphone lying there, and, with a reverence he didn't intend, left it exactly where it was. Behind the set wall, Chuck found a folding chair and sat. He closed his eyes. For a thin slice of time, he wasn't anyone's emblem or anecdote. He was a tired man whose chest held an old ache and a new quiet. Gina slipped in from the side door, touched his shoulder, and asked nothing. He opened his eyes and smiled the way people do when they're fine enough not to pretend. Two veterans waited near the loading dock, hands in pockets, not wanting to intrude, not willing to leave. When Chuck passed, One of them nodded and said, "That was the first time I didn't feel stupid for not shouting." Chuck squeezed his shoulder once. "Me too," he said. John stood at last. He walked back up, picked up the microphone like it might bite, and carried it to a stool. He set it down and left it upright, neat, as if returning a borrowed thing in better condition than he'd received it. He looked out over the vacated seats, paper cups, tissues, the shadow of people who'd been there so fully their absence felt like a presence. He whispered something only the room could hear and descended the stairs, lighter by a weight he still felt. One more producer, younger, both brave and afraid, cornered Chuck near the loading ramp. "We could help so many people if we aired the whole exchange," she said. "The rawness, I don't know, the permission." He nodded, grateful for her heart. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe we help more by letting them tell it to each other." She bit her lip and, for the first time that night, stopped thinking about reach and started thinking about repair. The last audience member left. Doors side shut. Air handlers throttled down to a lower hum that made the room sound like it was sleeping. Somewhere in the balcony a light buzzed and then steadied, the sound of a building editing itself into its night version. What remained was a stage that looked suddenly small and very human. 2 microphones, one upright on the stool, one laid where a hand had surrendered it. 2 half-empty bottles with their labels turned away. A strip of gaffer tape lifting at one end like a page that wanted to be turned. A single work light cast a warm cone that didn't reach the back rows. In that cone, dust moved like slow snow. From the hallway came one last voice, a security guard calling to another. "Kill the deck lights?" And the answering, "Leave one." The one stayed. And in that almost dark, the room held its own kind of prayer. Not words, not music, just the truth that had been said and the space it needed to keep echoing. 2 days later, Houston was still talking. What had happened that night was supposed to fade into another clip among thousands, but something about it refused to disappear. It wasn't the tears or the silence. It was the truth in both. The first headlines appeared before sunrise. Chuck Norris silences pastor mid-conference. Faith turns real in Houston. Then came the talk shows, the reaction panels, the late-night jokes. Within 48 hours, everyone had an opinion, and no one seemed to agree on what they'd witnessed. To some, it was the most authentic moment modern Christianity had ever broadcast. To others, it was humiliation disguised as humility. Hashtags divided the country. Hashtag faith versus fire. Hashtag Norris effect. Hashtag let Ann cry. Each thread pulling in a different direction. Clips flooded the internet. The raw footage that Chuck had asked not to air somehow leaked anyway, cut into short bursts that stripped the silence away and left only the clash. One edit ended on John's tears, another on Chuck's stillness. Neither captured the whole truth. In the middle of it all, John Gray stayed quiet for 48 hours, a record for him. His team begged him to respond, to control the narrative, but his voice mailbox stayed full of silence. Finally, on Sunday morning, he walked onto his church stage, not in a suit, but in a plain t-shirt. Cameras were already rolling. The crowd stood, unsure of what version of their pastor they were about to see. He smiled faintly. "I guess the internet thinks I got humbled," he said. A few uneasy laughs. Then, softer, "They're not wrong." The congregation leaned in. "Sometimes," he continued, "God sends a cowboy to preach where preachers forget how." That line broke something open. The crowd stood, cheering, not because of the words, but because they could feel they were real. No polish, no posture. Just a man telling the truth after losing a piece of himself and finding something better. After the service, he walked off stage and looked straight into one of the church's cameras. "Chuck," he said quietly, "if you're watching this, thank you for stopping me mid-speech. I needed that pause." The clip aired that evening. It hit harder than any headline. Within hours, even his critics were reposting it with a new tag, #ThePause. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Texas Hill Country, Chuck sat on his porch, reading none of it. His wife had shown him a few articles. He'd smiled and shaken his head. "They always hear the noise louder than the silence," he said. When a reporter called, asking, "How does it feel to break a pastor down on stage?" Chuck answered without anger, "If truth breaks you, maybe you needed to rebuild." Then he hung up, politely, firmly, and went back to feeding the horses. The noise didn't stop. It just evolved. Talk shows debated whether the Norris moment was staged. Bloggers dissected every word, every breath, searching for controversy. Some said Chuck was exploiting faith for relevance. Others swore he'd just reminded the world what conviction sounded like. But the ones who'd been in that room, the veterans, the single mothers, the people in recovery, they told a different story. "I cried that night," one woman wrote online. "Not because he made the pastor cry, but because I realized I haven't forgiven myself either." Thousands commented under her post. By midnight, #ForgiveYourself was trending. In the middle of the storm, someone leaked John's backstage video, the one he'd recorded for his team after the event. The clip was shaky, unedited. His eyes were red, his voice raw. "Tonight I didn't preach," he said. "Tonight I got preached to. And I wasn't ready." The line spread like fire. Even atheists shared it. One caption read, "For once, a preacher sounds human." Producers called Chuck again, offering exclusive interviews, documentaries, even a roundtable reunion with John. Every time, his answer was the same: let the moment breathe. Not everything needs a sequel. By the third week, even the noise began to soften. News anchors moved on to elections and scandals. But something had shifted in the way people talked about faith. Less shouting, more pauses between sentences. And still, in smaller circles, church groups, recovery meetings, army reunions, people replayed the Houston footage quietly, like watching lightning strike twice. A veteran in Arizona wrote in an open letter, "For the first time on live TV, someone talked about faith without selling it." That line reached Chuck eventually, printed out by a friend who mailed it to him. He read it once, smiled, and tucked it inside his Bible without saying a word. By then, the world had already moved on. But the people who were there, the ones who heard that silence firsthand, they didn't. They knew they'd witnessed something you couldn't rewind or post. Something that only happened once, and maybe that was the point. They didn't call it a reunion. The flyer just said, "Benefit for families of the fallen." No photos, no hint of what might happen. But by the time the Texas sun sank behind the arena, the parking lot was full. People came quietly, as if drawn by something they couldn't name. Veterans in worn jackets, mothers with folded flags, young couples who had watched the Houston clip online 100 times. Backstage, the air was thick with the smell of hot lights and dust. John stood near the curtain, palms sweating. He wasn't in a suit, just a dark shirt and rolled sleeves. The stage manager counted him down with raised fingers. John nodded, whispered, "Let it be real this time," and stepped into the light. The crowd rose, clapping, not with excitement, but with recognition. He waited for them to settle. "I once interrupted a man of peace," he began. "Tonight, I invited him to finish that sentence." The curtain opened. Chuck walked out slowly, no spotlight chasing him, no music, just the scrape of his boots on wood. The room stood again, but this time it wasn't for fame. It was for what he represented, quiet strength that had already spoken enough. He faced the audience and said simply, "Forgiveness doesn't start when you're right. It starts when you stop fighting." Then he turned toward John. "Even if the fight is with yourself." The words rippled through the hall. No one clapped. They just breathed differently. John stepped closer, his hand resting on Chuck's shoulder. "That night," he said, "you taught me how to listen." He smiled faintly. "Let me teach you how to feel joy again." Without waiting, he started to sing, a single line from an old hymn. His voice cracked on the first note, but he didn't stop. The crowd joined softly, unprompted. A woman in the front wiped her eyes. Someone in the balcony found harmony. Chuck stood still, then slowly joined in. His voice was rough, but it carried. When they finished, the silence that followed felt almost holy. John turned back to the microphone. "We came here to raise money for families," he said. "But maybe we're also raising something we lost. Our patience, our humility." Chuck nodded. "Healing doesn't need microphones," he said. "It needs tables, porches, and long drives with no talking. Take what started here and finish it there." Phones lifted, then lowered. People didn't want a video. They wanted to remember this as something they'd lived. They stayed on stage, talking like old friends. John shared a story about visiting a man he once judged. Chuck told one about writing a letter to someone he'd wronged years ago. The stories overlapped quietly until the room felt less like a crowd and more like a circle. A small child started to cry somewhere up high. No one shushed him. The sound belonged here, somehow. The lights dimmed just a little, the way evening dims before peace. John looked over. You think we got it right this time? Chuck's smile came slow. We didn't fix the world, he said. But we didn't break it more. They shook hands. Then John pulled him into a quick, honest hug. The applause that rose was soft, steady, less celebration, more relief. The MC came back, reading the donation total, voice trembling. People clapped again, not for numbers, but for the feeling of being part of something unspoken. Some lingered after, standing in the aisles, saying words like sorry and forgive me as if rediscovering them. When it was over, the curtain began to fall. The lights dimmed to gold. The crowd started to move, but Chuck leaned once more toward the mic and said, almost to himself, God doesn't interrupt. He redirects. The hall went quiet again. The words hung there like the last note of a song that refuses to end. Outside, the Texas night smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet. People stepped into it slowly, carrying home something they couldn't post, something that didn't need a witness to be real.